Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Schlein, Director of the Charities and Legal Services Division with the Maryland Secretary of State's Office. We're the ones that deal with commissioning notaries in the state of Maryland. And thanks for joining us for this latest in our 2025 series of town halls related to notaries public in the state of Maryland. Today's town hall is going to talk specifically about remote notarizations. We'll talk about the application process. We'll also talk some about what remote notarizations are. Before we get started here, just want to cover the ground rules for this town hall. Those of you who have been on prior town halls, you're probably very familiar with these. Just first and foremost, this town hall is being recorded. By joining this town hall, you're consenting to your participation in that recording. This town hall is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be legal advice. You'll see that on the slides here. Informational purposes only, not intended to be legal advice. And then just by way of general flow, we're going to go through slides and talk about this in general. You may find that your questions asked along the way, which hopefully we do. Again, this is about remote notarization specifically. We're not here today to talk about other notary stuff. We're just going to talk about remote notarization. So if you had a question about something completely unrelated, reach out to our notary division. I'll have the contact information up at the end of this. We have a whole series of town hall recordings that are posted on the main notary page of our website. That link will get shown a little later on as well. You can see any of our town hall recordings there about a variety of topics. Many over the last year and some even a little older than that. So if you have questions, throw it in that chat. There's a box that you can type questions into. If you do type a question, our notary officers may or may not answer that. They may hold it and read it off at the end. We'll try to do our best to answer all those questions as best as humanly possible. And if somehow we miss it, do not panic. We are human beings. We do pick up our phones and answer them. And if we don't answer them, we call you back. We answer our emails, usually all the same or next day that you're going to hear back from us if we miss you by phone. And the same or next day if you email us, far more often than not. So just know that as well. Also, refrain from answering questions unless you are myself or Carrie Ann, one of our notary officers at the Secretary of State. Please do not answer other people's questions. All along the years, we've had some well-intentioned folks trying to answer questions that somebody else had, and they give them the wrong answer. We don't want that to happen, so please refrain from answering other people's questions unless you work at the Secretary of State's office. And then at the end, after we conclude, we'll hang a little bit and take any other questions that folks want to discuss, at the very end. So thanks again for joining us. Remote notarizations. Time to have a little fun. Here we go. You always see this slide at the beginning of our town, or almost always see this slide at the beginning of our town halls. Sources of legal authority. This is where stuff from this presentation comes from the state constitution, the annotated code of Maryland, which is the state's law, and the code of Maryland regulations, which are the regulations that are, in furtherance of the annotated code of the state's law. So in these various sections. So generally, what do you have to do to become a remote notary? Well, first, you have to be a notary. You have to be commissioned as a notary. You can't be a remote notary unless you're already commissioned as a notary public. They are not separate, unrelated things. In order to become authorized to perform a remote notarization, you must first be a notary public and in good standing as such, cannot be expired. Generally, here's your qualifications to be a notary, right? You guys are familiar with these. If you watched the first or second town hall of the year, we talked about all those application requirements. 18, good moral character, live or work in the state, Nowadays, when you become a notary, you have to take a class and pass a test. When you renew your commission, you got to take the class every 4 years. I cannot stress how important it is that you pay attention in class. One of my favorite lines from folks, being sarcastic when I say that, is, Mike, I've been doing this 20 years, 15 years, 25 years. Yet the law completely changed on October 1st, 2020. It's very different. There are a lot more requirements. A lot more stuff is set in the law rather than just as guidelines. If you've been a notary for a long time and you're looking at me asking, hey, why am I even taking this class? I've been a notary forever. Half the time half the time the answer to my question back to them is, oh, really? It changed? Yeah, it did. It changed a lot. So you need to refresh yourself on the law and the requirements. You need to refresh yourself every 4 years when you get another commission. Pay attention, please. We take it seriously. If you're out there doing the wrong stuff as a notary, you may not get to keep that commission as a notary if we find out about it. Pay attention to that class. I cannot stress that enough. It teaches you the basics of your job as a notary public and the law as it's written at that time. When the laws change, the course has got to update their materials. We let them know that, and all that happens. So you want to become a remote notary. You're already a notary public. You're already currently commissioned. Pretty straightforward process. You're just going to notify us that you intend to perform remote notarial acts that are facilitated by communication technology. And you have to do that prior to performing any remote notarial acts. You got to tell us, if you're using electronic remote notarial acts, which RON vendor you're going to use, or which ones. You could use one or more of the remote online notary vendors. There's a list that we provide on our website of the authorized vendors. If they're an authorized vendor, the form nowadays is online. You can't pick a RON vendor that's not authorized by us because you won't have the option to select them on the remote notary notification form. So the good news is, if they're not on that list, they're not authorized. You can reach out to us offline if you need to. It's really good news to know that. It's also good because it helps save us a lot of incomplete, correct applications with people putting all kinds of random things on there. The notary must submit information to us, but it also must receive the authorization. You'll get an email from us, from our system, after we've approved your remote notary notification form that you submitted online. No more paper forms, all online. Been that way since the system updated in 2023, in the summer of 23. When completing the form, you need to select whether you're going to do remote notarial acts on electronic records or remote notarial acts on tangible records, or both. You can select one, the other, or both. You just need to tell us which one or both you're going to do. Now, it's very important. We're going to talk about the distinction between these later. They are different things. If you do not know what it is that you are signing up to do, you probably should not sign up to do it. And if you're here today to learn about that, that's a good thing. A lot of folks, I signed up to do this. What do I do? What is this? Figure out what it is, then sign up. Kind of understand what you're getting into before you get into it. I know the difference because if you're out there not following the guidelines for remote electronic notarizations or remote tangible record notarizations, you may not get to stay a remote notary or a notary at all if you don't know the requirements. It's spelled out pretty well in the handbook, I might say. If you don't have a handbook, get a handbook. But if you have a handbook, refer to that handbook. The last substantive changes to the remote notary stuff really came in 2022. We're going to talk about the fee going up in 24, but really 2022 is where the last batch of big changes to remote notarization stuff occurred. That occurred June 1st to 22 when remote notarizations for tangible records was brought into the law. So understand the difference between them. Like, so we're going to go here later on. One important thing to note, nothing shall require any person to accept, agree to, conduct, or complete a remote notarial act. If somebody agrees to do a remote notarization with you one time, they don't have to agree to it again. Can't make somebody do a remote notarization. So the authorization process, pretty straightforward. Complete the form online, submit it online. You're selecting one or more of the vendors if you're doing remote electronic notarizations. And if you're only doing remote tangible, then you don't have RON vendors that you have to select. It's pretty hard to incorrectly complete it at this point, the online form. It makes you acknowledge the statements there. You gotta check off on that before you submit the form. Please read those acknowledgments before you check off that form. And I understand the temptation to go, it's just a bunch of legal wording. You should read that before you sign off and submit a state form where you're promising the truth of the stuff on the form and that you understand what it is you're promising. Read those acknowledgments, make sure you understand them, make sure you know what they mean. If the form isn't completed or an unauthorized remote notary vendor is selected, you're going to get an email telling you that you're not authorized to perform remote notarial acts. Again, it's pretty hard to do that on today's filings. And you could resubmit remote notary notification forms to correct errors on an originally submitted form. You could submit a remote notary notification form if you change vendors along the way. If you are using RON vendor 1 and you decide you want to use RON vendors 1 and 2, you send us a new notification form and say, hey, Secretary of State, I'm now using RON vendors 1 and 2. So you may have a point in time where during your commission that you change vendors or add vendors. And when you do that, you just submit an updated remote notary notification form to tell us which new vendors you're going to use. So you just submit another form, we review and approve, and at that point you're using those vendors. But make sure, if you're adding to your vendors rather than just changing, if you're going to go from vendors A, B, and C to A, B, C, D, E, F, or however it's going to be, make sure you submit every vendor you're going to use on that second one. Don't just give us the new ones. That would tell us you're changing from A, B, and C to D, E, and F. If you're going to use all of them, list all of them. Very important here. Very important here. The notary must submit a new remote notary notification form upon the renewal of each of their notary commissions. If you are renewing after you go to the courthouse and take the oath of office for your next commission, that is when you want to submit your next remote notary notification form. Remember, when you renew and we issue that commission to the clerk of the court for you to go get sworn in for your next commission, that next commission is not active until you've been sworn in at the clerk of the court. So if you give us another remote notary notification form after you renewed, but before you've been sworn in, guess what? That notification form applies to the previous commission that is not yet expired, or expired because you picked up the new one. Very important. We try to catch these, we really do, and reach out to you. But we're people, we don't always catch it, but we try. You need to know that, though, as a notary that's going to apply. It's in the handbook too. It's definitely in there. But your remote notary notification expires with your commission. So if your commission is on its way out and you give us a remote notary form before you picked up and sworn in for that next commission, that notification dies with that old commission. That remote notarization authorization dies with that prior commission. You got to wait till after you're sworn in at the clerk of the court and your new commission is active. That's when you give us your next remote notary notification form. You could do it as soon as you get sworn in. The clerk plugs in the data now, and your commission is emailed to you as soon as they plug in your qualification date, the date you got sworn in the clerk's office. As soon as you get that commission in your email inbox, you know the clerk has plugged in your swear-in date, and that means that we know your next commission is active. That next minute, you can go become a remote notary on that new commission. It all happens like that, super fast. So the moment that qualification date's plugged in the system, you get the email from the system that says, here's your next commission. Right after that happens, you could go do your next remote notary authorization form for the new commission. It's a very timely system. Happens in real time. Your authority, as we kind of mentioned here, in different ways to perform remote notarial acts expires when your notary commission expires. And a notary authorized to perform remote notarial acts, you can cancel your authorization. Just send us an email, something in writing telling us that you no longer want to do remote notarizations, and we'll take off that authorization. I don't know if we ever really get any of them, but you can do that if you are authorized and you want to not be authorized but still be a notary. You could cancel your remote authorization but still be a notary if you're still commissioned. Performing remote notarial acts. Important here, we kind of talked about it, making sure everything is accurate when you submit your form. We can't authorize something if somebody's made a material misstatement or omission of fact. We see this far more on a regular renewal or new application than we ever do on a remote notary notification, but it could be on either one. And a notary cannot represent that they can perform notarial acts remotely if they're not authorized to do so. If you're out there promoting remote notarial acts and you're not authorized to do them, that's a problem that could result in you not being a notary anymore. So make sure you're authorized before you're doing them. I'm going to go back a sec before I get into the more recent changes. What's very important to point out here, I think, is that I don't see it like I used to. I don't think we see it overall like we used to, but remote notarizations went into effect in the law on October 1st, 2020. For remote notarizations on electronic records is what went into the law on October 1st, 2020. Remote tangible acts, remote notarizations on tangible records went into effect June 1st, 2022. There was a brief period from late March of 20 until September 30th of 2020, where there were some temporary orders in place that allowed remote notarizations. There was temporary guidance. That all went away on September 30th. October 1st, the law took effect. We pushed out a lot of information about this. We still, really up until a couple years ago, saw people citing the old guidance that hadn't been in effect for a couple of years. So I just want to say that at this point, I hope I don't see any more of that. But that temporary guidance was only in effect from the early state of emergency days till September 30th of 2020. After that, the rule of law, the law itself, was what was used for remote notarization. So that temporary emergency stuff went away when the law took effect. So after it took effect October 1st, 2020, we were in a land of remote notarizations on electronic records. Excuse me. And effective June 1st, 2022, a few things occurred that changed some stuff related to the laws for remote notarizations. It increased the max fee that we can permit by regulation. We'll talk about the actual fee here later. It repealed the exception to remote notarizations that applied to wills and trusts. So when the law first took effect on October 1st, 2020, you could not remotely notarize a will or a trust. Now you can. That went away June 1st, 2022. And the way they did that was they just took the wording in the law, said that, except for wills and trusts, you can remotely notarize. Just took out the except for wills and trusts. So you can remotely notarize. Clarified credential analysis and identity proofing, especially as it relates to what type of remote notarial act you're performing. Established some requirements and procedures for notarizing tangible records. It specified procedures by which a notary may administer an oath or affirmation remotely. Authorized the Secretary of State to adopt regulations for reasonable confirmation of tangible record, and clarified communication technology requirements applicable to all the remote notarizations. We're going to talk a little bit about remote notarizations in general, and then we're going to get to the difference between electronic and tangible. There were some regulation changes in 2024. Regulations increased the allowable fee to charge for a remote notarial act to $8, and for remote notarial acts up to $30. Originally it was $25. Now you can charge $30 for a remote notarial act. Some regs were changed regarding online notary vendors, especially in part of clarifying, when they're needed versus, remote tangible acts that don't necessarily need a RON vendor. Obligations of the notary when using these communication technologies. As you'll see for remote notarizations on tangible records, a lot more is on you, right? The RON vendor shoulders a lot of the requirements for remote online notarizations, but remote notarizations for tangible records, the burden falls pretty much entirely on the notary to do everything right and keep everything properly. And clarifying when, the remote notification form, splitting it between the two types of remote notarizations that you could do. One important thing to point out, even though we're talking about remote notarial acts, if you're a Maryland notary, you cannot notarize outside the state of Maryland. You'll kind of learn here, it doesn't really matter where the signer's at for remote notarization. Matters where the notary is, though. The notary's got to be standing in Maryland when they notarize, each and every time, forever and always. Don't care where in Maryland. Don't care where in Maryland, but you got to be standing in Maryland. So into the details of the remote acts. What is it? It's just an act performed by a notary using certain communication technology for a remotely located individual. It is taking the in-person notary experience that's still plenty well allowed under the law, and still, I think, by far the most common way that things are notarized, and allows it to be replaced with communication technology to notarize while you're standing in one place and notary's in another spot. Communication technology still has all the elements of personal appearance and identification, but with some additional technology requirements or enhancements to ensure the person is who they say they are. You'll hear them called all kinds of different things. You see remote online notarial acts, remote notarizations, remote online notarizations. Those are all different terms that folks use to identify a remote notarial act. Some folks talk about electronic notarizations. That's a different thing in the way that we define it. So you won't hear me call it an electronic notarization. You will hear me say remote notarizations on electronic records. That is different than an electronic notarization. So I talked a bit before about remote notarial acts becoming law October 1st, 2020. Video conferencing technology, remote notarial acts on tangible records went into effect June 1st, 2022. So from October 1st, 2020 through June 1st, 2022, you had to use a remote online notary vendor and perform a remote notarial act on electronic records to facilitate that remote notarization under the law. Again, we'll talk about each of them separately. So just a little bit here, remote notarial acts for wills or trust instruments couldn't be performed from October 1st through May 31st, October 1st, 2020 through May 31st, 22. Effective June 1st, 22, wills and trust instruments could be remotely notarized. So now all forms of documentation can be notarized remotely. The validity of a remote notarial act performed by a Maryland notary public authorized to perform remote notarial acts shall be determined under the laws of Maryland, regardless of the physical location of the remotely located individual at the time of the notarial act. So again, you got to be located in Maryland if you're a Maryland notary. We don't care where the signer's at, but a Maryland notary needs to be standing in Maryland at any point in time where they're notarizing, even if notarizing for somebody remotely located elsewhere. The way that I could best describe what's happening or why that's relevant, somebody's coming to you for remote notarization. They are kind of virtually traveling to you in Maryland. That's the best way to think about it. I'm virtually traveling to this notary who's located in Maryland. The Maryland notary who's doing it remotely is located in Maryland, and therefore subject to Maryland law when it comes to remote notarial acts in Maryland. So just like any other notarization, you can't knowingly participate when you know someone that's making a statement or signing a record is prohibited by a foreign state in which remotely located individual is located. Just in general, you can't knowingly participate if you know somebody is trying to scam somebody or committing fraud or perjury or something like that. If you know that that's happening, you shouldn't be in the business of notarizing it. This one here is a little more specific, though, to if something's prevented by law in a foreign country where somebody's located, you shouldn't notarize it if you know that. So it gives a lot of leeway there. You cannot know that the individual making the statement or signing the record is prohibited. You may not know. Upon authorization to perform remote notarial acts, the notary or person acting on behalf and at the direction of the notary creates an audiovisual recording of the performance of the notarial act. What does that mean? That's a fancy way of saying you or your bond vendor are going to create an audiovisual recording of the performance of the act. If it's an electronic record and you got a RON vendor, that RON vendor technology is doing that. If you are doing remote notarizations on tangible records, you got to make sure you hit the record button, and then you have to keep it. Remotely located individual located outside the United States. So if you do have somebody located outside the United States, you're going to remotely notarize for them. The record must be filed with or relate to a matter subject to the jurisdiction of the United States or involve property located in territorial jurisdiction of the United States or involve transactions substantially connected with the United States. So you have these few restrictions here when you're remotely notarizing for somebody outside the United States. It could be anywhere as long as that remote notarization pertains to these elements. It could be standing on the moon, maybe one day Mars, who knows? But the person signing could be anywhere, but the record has to be subject to the jurisdiction in the U.S. or involve property in the U.S. or involve a transaction substantially connected with the United States. So those are the baseline criteria. So now we're going to get into remote notarizations on an electronic record, specifically on an electronic record. We're not talking about tangible records yet. We're going to talk about them next, specifically electronic records. So getting started. The law went into effect, as again, we talked about October 1st, 2020. Some landmark changes there, not just remote notarizations. Journal requirements changed completely. Stamp requirements updated. Notarial certificate requirements changed completely. Identification requirements changed completely. October 1st, 2020 saw a lot of stuff happen in notary law. And it really formalized a lot of things. I'll say, effectively adopted remote uniform law, notarial acts, RULONA. If you've ever heard something's RULONA been said, remote uniform law on notarial acts. We effectively adopted, with some Maryland specific stuff, RULONA as of 2019. That went into effect October 1st, 2020. Remote notarization: a signer appears before the notary at the time of notarization using audiovisual technology. The signer will sign the document electronically in these cases. The notary notarizes the document electronically in these cases. Remote notarization on an electronic record is always, it begins and ends electronic. It is an electronic document with electronic signatures, electronic notary seal. The technology allows you, the notary, to witness the signature being affixed by the signer, affix their own seal, all in real time. So again, effectively replacing the in-person notarization. It allows that to happen. You can watch them on cam. You can watch that signature appear on the document. You can affix your seal on that record, and that all happens contemporaneously. Just like if you're notarizing in person, everything's got to be completed contemporaneously, right at the same time in occurrence. Same thing happens, but this is happening remotely. All in electronic stuff on a remote online notary vendor. So again, a few more terms that you might see: webcam, online notarization, virtual notarization. These are all occurring at the same time and place. It's an electronic virtual occurrence. Kind of like this town hall is a virtual town hall, right? Instead of me standing in front of a room of people, standing here and sitting in front of my computer, talking on the screen, and we'll all be, you can interact, and we can interact with each other, and we'll do that at the end. So remote online notary vendors have some obligations under the law, and their technology primarily must be used to facilitate a notarial act for a remotely located individual. It includes identity proofing and credential analysis, which we're going to talk about what those are. Help you identify a remotely located individual and verify they really are who they say they are. RON vendors have to provide you training on how to use their technology. If you are a notary public, I think everybody that's a notary public, or almost everybody except for maybe the last few, have had to sit through a course of study, either to become a notary or to renew their commission in the last 4 years. Because that went into effect October 1st, 2021. So theoretically, you know how to be a notary, right? You sat through that course of study. The RON vendor is just teaching you how to use their technology to facilitate what you already do as a notary. That's what the RON vendor training is doing. It's not teaching you how to be a notary. You already know that. It's teaching you how to use their technology to facilitate the remote notarial acts that you're going to do on their platform. Instruction prepares notaries to use the RON vendor's technology and ensure compliance with the requirements of the law. Technology offered by RON vendors shall include a process for identity proofing and credential analysis, as our law describes. What are those things? Sorry, guys, fighting off a bit of a cold here. Identity proofing is a process or service that a third party provides a notary with the means to verify identity of a remotely located individual by reviewing personal information from public and private data sources. Think of knowledge-based questions. Anybody ever had to answer some questions to get into something? That's identity proofing. What's credential analysis? A third party confirms the validity of an identification credential by review of public or private data sources. They're analyzing that identification presented to you remotely to verify it's a valid ID. It must be performed by reputable third parties Your Ron vendor's doing this for you. Uh, if your first thought was, oh my gosh, do I have to do this myself? Who is going to do this for me? Where do I find them? Don't worry. If you're doing Ron vendor notarizations on electronic records, that technology is already doing this. They've figured that out. You are using their technology. All right. So do not panic about that. Last time I talked about this, there was a brief bit of panic about that. We got some questions about it. So I just want to throw that out before anybody has kind of momentary worry, like, oh my goodness, am I doing this right? If you're using Ron vendor technology, it's already got identity proofing and credential analysis wrapped into it. I'm not going to get into all the details of what's behind that. It's spelled out pretty good in the law, though, and the handbook adds on to that if anybody needs to take a look at it. But the Ron vendor's technology provides this mechanism. How can you identify somebody on remote notarial acts and electronic records? The notary may perform the remote notarial act if the notary has satisfactorily identified a signer. Just like if you're doing it in person, you got to be able to satisfactorily identify the signer. How do you do that? Well, you have personal knowledge of their identification, maybe, or you have a credible witness that you've used to verify the identity of the signer on oath or affirmation, or remote presentation of a identification credential, which will include credential analysis of the identification credential and identity proofing of the individual. So they're going to have to pass through credential analysis and identity proofing in order to come into the remote notarial act, the online transaction. You're still going to look at their ID. They're still going to show you their ID, but they will have had to pass as well through credential analysis and identity proofing. You must reasonably be able to confirm that the record in which the remotely located individual made a statement or executed is the same record before you. Pretty easy to do on a Ron vendor technology because it's there on screen in real time. Audiovisual recordings are created for remote notarial acts. They must be kept for a minimum of 10 years. 10 whole years. Guess what else has to be kept for 10 years? Your journal. Right? For your journal, it's 10 years from the last entry in it. So good marriage of 10 years there. The recording must be kept for 10 years. Either you retain it, maybe your Ron vendor retains it, but your agreement with the Ron vendor should include something about you being able to access them, whether you stay with that Ron vendor or not. They should, because they're verifying that's possible when they get authorized as a Ron vendor. A Ron vendor in Maryland can't keep you from your records that you used on their platform. All right. If there's that kind of thing in the law that says basically if a notary is no longer kind of able to do it themselves or passes away or something like that, that the guardian or personal representative is the one that's now required to keep the records. You can engage in a third-party repository to keep your records for you. By written contract, you can engage that third party as to be a repository and provide the required storage. That repository has to be either deemed an approved repository by us, or you have a contract that does these two things. We don't have any approved repositories. Nobody's ever come asking to be an approved repository. So you need to have a contract with a repository. That contract must enable the notary to comply with the retention requirements of this subtitle, even if that contract is terminated, or provide that information will be transferred to the notary if the contract is terminated. Again, it's got to be kept for 10 years. If you're using a Ron vendor and you stop using them, However, that agreement is teed up between you and the RON vendor. They may keep housing them and you might have access to them, or they might say, here you go, notary, they're yours now. And then you got to keep them. Again, minimum of 10 years after the recording is created. If you do it today, 10 years from today, I don't even want to think about what that year that is. That's 2035. How do we get this far? That's how long you got to keep a remote notarial act recording that's done today. How long you got to keep the journal entry as well for as long as that as well. 10 years. It's a long time. Make sure you're ready for it. So a few more things here about RON acts on electronic records. Still on electronic records for remote notarizations. Certificate must indicate the notarial act involved remotely located individual and performed using communication technology. There's some wording in the law there that helps. There's some wording in the handbook that helps, but as long as your notarial certificate wording indicates that it was a remote, the notarial act involved a remotely located individual and was performed using communication technology, you're good. But that certificate wording has to say that. And those certificates required for every notarial act now, as of October 1st, 2020. Notaries shall attach or logically associate the notary's electronic signature or official stamp to the electronic record. It must comply with that X.509 standard. That's what the standard is in the law. Again, nothing shall require any person to accept, agree to, or conduct or complete a remote notarial act. A person that agrees to accept, agree to, conduct, or complete remote notarial acts may refuse to do so in the future in another transaction. Think about that again. Person that agrees to accept, agree to, conduct, or complete. We're not just talking about whether the signer wants to do it. We're talking about whether or not somebody agrees to take it to begin with. And anybody that's ever turned in a document that was properly notarized, or had somebody that you notarized for turn in something that was properly notarized, and the place said, yeah, we're not taking that. That happens sometimes. We can't answer for that because we can just tell you how to do your job right. And if you do it right, we're kind of usually shaking our head too as to why something isn't accepted. But that happens sometimes. And communication technology shall provide reasonable security measures to prevent unauthorized access to these few things here: the live transmission, methods used to perform credential analysis and identity proofing, and the electronic record that itself is the subject of the Notarial Act. So those RON vendor technologies have to have reasonable security measures to prevent people from getting unauthorized access to that RON workflow. So talking about remote notarial acts on a tangible record. We talked about this going into effect June 1st, 2022. It allows remotely located individuals to sign a tangible record. In other words, a hard copy of a document using a wet ink signature. A hard copy of a document using a wet ink signature. So this remote process, the document itself is going to stay tangible throughout. What you'll notice here is at no point does this thing become electronic. It does not. It's not something that you sign and email to somebody or fax to somebody that they sign and email and fax back. It begins and ends tangible. Wet ink signatures. Notary signs with a wet ink signature. Affixes their embosser or their stamp as their notary seal to the physical record. Couple things in bold. Very important. We talked about different ways of identifying people for the remote acts on electronic records. If you're going to remotely notarize a tangible record from someone, you must know them through personal knowledge or a credible witness. If you have to identify somebody using their ID to remotely notarize for them, You cannot remotely notarize a tangible record for anyone. You can only do this for people you know. What about the credible witness? Well, for the credible witness, it's got to be somebody you know. It can't just be any random credible witness. Why? Because you can't identify them using an ID on this type of notarial act. Because we're not using a Ron vendor in this case. Most likely, we're talking about notarizations that can be done through really any video conferencing technology. So they're not going through credential analysis and identity proofing on this type of notarial act, remote notarial act. So you got to know the signer personally, or you got to have a credible witness that you know personally, that knows the signer personally, that can vouch for them. Got to have that chain of connection there if you're going to use credible witness. So we're really only dealing with people we know on remote notarial acts and tangible records, not people we don't know. If a notary must identify an individual using identification credential, the notary must use a Ron vendor for the remote notarial act. On a tangible record, this type of remote notarial act causes a tangible record to be signed and notarized. That record must be tangible throughout the process. Again, mentioned, cannot be converted into electronic. Video conferencing technology or a Ron vendor could be used to accomplish this. This specific type of remote notarial act on a tangible record, again, not talking about electronic anymore. We've now moved to tangible record remote notarization. The notary is responsible for recording that notarial act and maintaining a recording for 10 years. If you're just using on a remote notarial act on a tangible record, if you're using FaceTime, Skype, I don't know, Teams, Zoom, Google Meet, whatever it is you're using, you got to hit that record button for that transaction. You got to save that recording for that transaction for at least 10 years. It's yours. You got to keep it. Remote notarial act on a tangible record, the process, individual appearing before the notary during the audiovisual recording signs the tangible record and a declaration. Required declaration is spelled out in the law and in the handbook. I'm not going to confuse people more. But there's a declaration in the law. It's also found in the handbook. That declaration must accompany the tangible record that is being signed remotely for this tangible record remote notarization. So if it's something that requires an oath, affirmation, or acknowledgement to the individual appearing before the notary must take that oath, affirmation, or acknowledgement of the individual appearing before them remotely on that communication technology. That must be part of the required recording. So you're going to have them show you the document, sign the document. You can either administer the oath, affirmation, acknowledgement if one of them is required. The individual that signed the record must send the tangible record and declaration to the notary no later than 3 days after the notarial act was performed. I'm going to sit here and marinate on this one for a second. Get a lot of questions about this. It means exactly what it says it means. The individual that signed the record, so we've done everything on the recording that's required by the signer. The recording ends. That individual must send the tangible record and the declaration. So again, we're sending the tangible record. We're not sending an electronic copy of it. We are sending the tangible record that was just signed and on which the declaration was added or attached. Tangible record and declaration go to the notary no later than 3 days after the notarial act was performed. Send it within 3 days. Does not say arrive to the notary within 3 days. That's about all I can say on that. It must be sent within 3 days. People always say, well, what if I don't get it till day 4 or 5? Was it sent in 3 days? That's all the law requires. Can they hand deliver it to me? Sure. That's sending it within 3 days, as long as it's done within 3 days, right? Of course, if that's the case, why not just do it in person when they get there, right? Maybe there's a smart reason why that wouldn't work, but I don't know. But they must send it to the notary no later than 3 days after the notarial act was performed. So the notary gets it. Maybe it's delivered by mail or courier or UPS, FedEx, whatever. However it was sent. I can't name all the places that send stuff, but just giving a few examples. The notary gets it. So after receipt of the tangible record and declaration, what must the notary do? The notary must reasonably confirm the tangible record received is the tangible record from the audio-visual recording. How can you do that? You have a recording. You can look at the record that was signed on the recording and compare it to what you have in front of you. It should be the same thing. Maybe have them hold it up, right? So you can read the document or have a recorded image of it when you're doing the notarial act for them, when they're signing it in the actual recording. But you have to reasonably confirm the tangible record you got is the same one from the audiovisual recording, and execute the certificate required by law for the remote notarial act on the tangible record. Again, that's the wording is found in the law and the handbook. There's certificates for each type of notarial act. If anybody wants to know more about different types of notarial acts or certificates, check out the handbook, check out the law. We got an entire hour-ish town hall on that as well, posted on our website. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on certificates. I'll go back here a sec before I go on to the helpful information stuff. So that's the process. Remote notarization for tangible record done. What happens with that tangible record after it's notarized? Whatever needs to happen. Does it need to go back to the signer? Does it need to be filed somewhere else? As if the notary is, some other profession that requires that they keep it. However that works between the notary and the signer. I want to say it's important here. You have to be able to identify somebody using personal knowledge. You have to know them well enough, dealing sufficient to know who they are. There's wording in the law. A little mad at myself for not having it here. That deals with what is personal knowledge. And so you have to have dealing sufficient to have sufficient certainty about the identification of that individual. Do you kind of know them? Do you know them, or do you know them? Like, you know them. You deal with them regularly and sufficiently. Not, oh, they showed up at my business one time and I've seen them before. Or they come into my business every now and then and I've seen them before. Do you know who they are? Maybe you've identified them previously and you remember who they are. Maybe you know them, personally or professionally through dealing sufficient to be certain of their identification. That's personal knowledge. You got to have that to do a remote notarial act on a tangible record. And again, earlier I mentioned some of the stuff being on you, the notary, rather than the RON vendor. For electronic records, the RON vendor is doing most of the work with that technology to store the document, and your journal might be kept there or through some third party that they've worked out. However, all that's working out, they're keeping the recording, all that stuff for the required time. And if at some point you stop using that RON vendor, they're going to keep it so you can come back to it, or they're going to give it to you so you can house it from then on. On a remote notarial act on a tangible record, you're keeping it. It's on you and all on you for all 10 years. because you're not using a RON vendor, most likely. You could, but you're most likely not using a RON vendor for tangible notarization. So you got to keep that recording. We take that stuff seriously. You should take that stuff seriously. We get folks that don't keep sufficient records and go, no, yeah, it's important. And if we find out about a notarization and we're contacting you about a notarization, somebody probably said something that wasn't good about it. And now you really want to have good records. Because if you don't have good records, that's not a good look. Right? So keep your recordings. Because I gotta keep a recording. I gotta save it. Yeah, save the darn thing somewhere. Put it on some secure place where you can save it and where you can find it later. Hopefully you never need to, but you might. And when you might have to, trust me, you want to have it. Because if you ever need it, if you've done your job well and you have your records to show that, you will show yourself clear and perfect and all that, and deflect whatever unnecessary attention or dispute is going on away from you and onto whatever it is. But sometimes notaries get dragged into that stuff. There's a dispute on something that had your notarial act on it. Could be recent, could be 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 years ago. Things have a funny way of coming back up, though, especially when stuff goes wrong, right? Everything's good till it's not. And then when it's not good, they find anything and everything they can. If you're going to get dragged into something, you want to have your records with you, because it can show not only do you have your records, that you thoroughly document everything, lends more credibility to you as the notary, the notary, the individual that's an officer of the state of Maryland when acting as a notary. And like I said, deflect any of that unwanted attention on whatever their dispute is off of you and onto the parties that are actually fighting about it that you just happen to get dragged into. Keep the good records. There's some helpful links here. I'm going to go to our contact page in a second, and then we're going to do some question and answer. Carrie and I are going to go back and forth with some questions in the chat box. So I'm going to move to the contact page for a second, but do not fret. I will come back to this page here in a minute. I want you to better write down the contact info because that's a lot less to write down. But if anybody wants these links, this is where you should go for notary information in Maryland. Right here are the links. That first link is to our main notary page. This town hall is getting recorded. It's going to get posted online. That's where it's getting posted. All those bottom links there below, new and renewal information, remote information, course of study providers, FAQs. You can get to all that from the main notary page on our website, which is that first link. One of my favorite questions to ask when folks are talking to us on the phone is, who told you you can do that? When it's something, sometimes it's pretty outrageous. I saw it on a chat forum online. Don't believe everything you see on the internet. Right? Anybody can say anything on the internet. Get it from sources that have your best interests at hand. I like to think we do as much as we possibly can. Education providers, you take the course of study. They have the information they need to have in that course of study. They're a good resource as well. Beyond that, that person that said it in the chat forum online could have been a notary from a whole nother state with a whole nother set of requirements. One time when I dug into it with somebody, it turns out they were talking to a notary from another country that had totally different powers than us. Right? So get to the sources for Maryland notary information. That first web page is where you really want to land. Here's our contact info. You get emails from that, the town hall invitations. When you're asking general questions about notarizations, or what are the requirements of being a notary, or how do I apply, how do I renew, when do I apply, when do I renew, go to dlnotary_sos@maryland.gov. That's the main notary division email address. It's not the town hall email address. We're only really checking that around these town hall occurrences. Are really supposed to be specific questions about the town hall itself. General notary questions, go to dlnotary_sos@maryland.gov. dlnotary_sos@maryland.gov. Direct phone line 410-974-5520. Rings right to the notary division. We got 3 notary officers that work here. One of them's probably on the phone already. Kind of works that way. So if you don't get an answer, leave a message. We'll call you back as quick as possible. Like I said at the beginning, it's usually, if it's not the same day, it's usually the next day. We get back to you as quickly as we can with the staff we have at any given point in time. We're people too. Sometimes people end up being off or sick or family, that needs something. We're also people. Please remember that when calling us and trying to talk to us. And same with leaving a message. Some days it really is just one person on the phones for everybody, and that's a tough day. So please be kind to them. They work really hard, and they do really, really work hard and care to try to help everybody out as quickly as possible. But we also got to follow the law, just like we ask you to do. So they give you the right answer, which hopefully is the one you want. But I've learned enough in life to know that's not always the case. Sometimes they got to give you an answer you don't want to hear. We don't have fun with that either. But sometimes it just is. So that's the contact information. Carrie Ann, how are we doing in the chat box? What's going on?
Actually, it was a pretty good chat box today.
Yeah,
a couple of really good questions came in at the end, and I kind of want to hit those couple first because you just finished talking about what they're asking about.
Okay.
So someone asked, how do I get an e-stamp?
How do you get what? An e-stamp?
An e-stamp.
That's a good question. Probably from your RON vendor. If you're doing remote online notarizations, I bet you your RON vendor has a preferred provider of an electronic stamp for those remote notarizations on electronic records. I'm not a betting person, but I'd be willing to bet a lot of money. We don't have any authorized providers of e-stamps. I know they're out there, but my first inclination would be to ask your RON vendor, hey, do you have a preferred e-stamp provider? Do you have a resource I can use? I bet they do. And if they don't, I'd be kind of surprised, but I'm sure at least one person will probably be able to raise their hand later and say, Mike, you're wrong on that. I definitely had that happen once. And you're right, but more likely than not, they're going to have that.
And to go off of that, someone else had asked, can they use a software like Adobe to create their own electronic stamp?
Going to go back to the slide. I can find it in my own darn thing. Right here. Electronic signature and stamp. Digital certificate complying with the X.509 standard adopted by International Telecommunication Union or a similar industry standard technology. If you can do that with Adobe, cool, go do it. If you cannot, then no. I don't know the actual specific answer to that specific example.
Okay. That was from Brittany Crawford.
Right there.
She also asked,
do I need
to ask to see their ID, and do they need to provide a copy of their ID? I'm not real sure if she's referring to remote tangible at that time. So maybe if she's still on there,
I'm going to answer
the question.
Yeah, well, I can answer them both, remote electronic and remote tangible. We'll knock them both out.
Yeah, it was for
ID,
tangible.
Yes. Go ahead, Brittany.
No, I was just saying it was for tangible.
Tangible, okay. For tangible, if you got to identify them, you can't notarize for them. You got to know them through personal knowledge. So your way of identifying them is personal knowledge, and that's how you were recorded in your journal. If you need to see an ID to notarize for them, you can't do tangible.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
All right.
Cheryl
says, what do I do if they don't send me the tangible record?
Good question. I've never had any. I'm sure that has happened. Nobody's ever reached out and said, hey, they never sent me the record. Keep your recording. That's what you do. Keep your recording. You've got your journal entry should already be made during the recording. So I think the best thing you can probably do is just note your journal that, never received, and if you get it after the deadline, you find out that it took 6 months for them to send or something crazy like that, you just reject it, can't notarize it, and make note of it in your journal. You'll notice the more you talk to us at the Secretary of State's office and some of the education providers around, the number one answer to what do I do in this weird or unique scenario? Write it in your journal. Associate it in the journal entry for that notarial act. And the best thing you can do in this case, if nothing shows up, you're waiting on it, nothing appears, make note in the journal. Hey, whatever, if you notarized it or you watched them sign it all on October 1st, to say, for example, just making up some dates here, and it's today and you realize I never got that. Go back to your journal and just say, what's today's date? 11/10/25, never received tangible record to complete notarization. Done and done. Just make note of it. On the off chance anything weird ever happens or that shows up later with a name on it, especially if it shows up with your name on it, you'll have a note in your record that says, I never got that. Stranger things have happened. But that would be a pretty weird one if somebody went through the problem of remotely notarizing and going through that to just turn around and not send it. Maybe they found an in-person notary that could do it for them quickly. Who knows? That's, I would like to hope that's probably the most likely explanation. But, make note of it in your journal that it was never received, so you have documentation that you never completed it, should there ever be a question about it. It's a good question.
Thank you.
So, question from earlier in the day. I cannot say the person's name. I'm really sorry. If a person needed to give power of attorney to someone in his home country, such as Africa, to stand on his behalf, not sure what they're referring to. It was during the part where you were talking about notarizations. It has to be pertaining to the United States.
Yeah. So the short answer there is, if the notarization has nothing to do with the United States, you can't remotely notarize it for them. So if somebody's contacting you from any country that's not the United States, I'm trying to go find the exact wording. I know it's in here somewhere. There it is. That wording at the bottom's not met, can't be done. So if you're the remote notary and somebody wants a notarization done in another country and it has nothing to do with the jurisdiction of the United States, property located in the US, or a transaction substantially connected with the US, you cannot remotely notarize it. If it doesn't meet that, you can't remotely notarize it. Somebody might want to ask, what is substantially connected with? I don't know. We'll find out. That's the wording in the law. That's not further defined anywhere, but that's the element. So I think that's about the only way I could answer that question. The specifics, we wouldn't get into on a recording here something super duper specific about a very specific instance. If you have a question about that, I'd encourage you to call us offline. We don't really like to answer those types of very situation specific questions because sometimes it gives folks the wrong impression about something that, they may have similar but not exact details that they may take that answer and run and it'd be the wrong answer. So we're going to answer it generally. I don't want to get into a specific situation, but if you have a specific situation, you want to talk it out, reach out to us offline at this email.
someone piggybacked off the question. They threw it in the chat box about if they could use the ID for, if they have to record the ID. It says, to piggyback off the ID question, would it be sufficient to have the previous ID the person's prior to the notarization?
Well, if it's about tangible records, you can't use identification. So if we're remotely notarizing something on a tangible record, the only thing you can use to identify them is personal knowledge or that credible witness. And you got to know that credible witness personally, because you cannot use ID to identify them. So if we're piggybacking on the remote tangible question, that's the answer. Get the notion of identifying people for remote tangible records out of your head. You cannot identify people using identification credential. You have to have personal knowledge of their identity. If you do not have personal knowledge of their identity when you are remotely notarizing on a tangible record for them, or you don't have a credible third party to identify them that you do know personally as well, you can't notarize. There's no reason to record an identification credential on a remotely notarized document for a tangible record because you have nothing to identify. You have personal knowledge is the method of identification that you should record in that scenario. Personal knowledge is the method of identification. So that is the method. You still could get there, in your journal, you got to have how you identified them, the method, in this case, personal knowledge. You still got to get their home address and all. You can ask them. You can have them show their ID for that so you can write it down easier maybe. But your method of identification is not identification credential. It's only personal knowledge. You fill out your journal from there.
All right. Susan asked, at what point do you collect the fees on RON or RIN-X?
On RON, it's all rolled into the platform. Your platform will demonstrate how that works on their platform. So if you have a RON vendor, you'll learn that when you learn how to use their platform. For a remote notarization on a tangible record, up to you. However you want them to pay you. That's totally fine. The document's got to stay tangible, not the payment method necessarily. So I don't really care what method they use to pay you for a notarization. You could use any method to pay for a notarization. You just can't charge them more than $30 for a remote notarial act. So when a RON vendor, it's getting charged through the workflow on that platform. Every vendor is a little different. I'd be lying if I said I knew when they all do it. But for a remote tangible, talk about that beforehand.
All right. Brittany,
come to an agreement on that.
Brittany wants to know, when completing a RON, the platform keeps record. I believe you stated earlier that I would need to handwrite it into my journal for recording.
If you're doing a remote online notarization, you're going to have an electronic journal. You're going to have an electronic journal to track your remote notarizations, and it's probably going to come through your vendor. So that journal for electronic remote notarial acts is going to be an electronic journal. And you may have more than one journal. Before we go down this journal requirement, the whole town hall dedicated to journals. I don't want to really get too focused on journal specific stuff and have us go down a whole nother rabbit hole. But there's a lot of info on journal requirements in the law and in the handbook and on our prior town hall about it. I would just encourage you to look at those materials that are out there for journal requirements. But if it's a remote online notarization on electronic record, it's going to be an electronic journal requirement. You're probably not going to be handwriting anything. It's all electronic.
I think everybody's just deciding to keep throwing their questions into the chat box here.
All right. Well, we'll do one or two more, and then we'll conclude recording and hang on at the end.
Okay. Craig wants to know, has your office seen an increased number of notaries applying to become remote notaries? And then, are there any potential legislations coming down the pipeline that will impact the guidance for remote notarization?
Legislation, not that I'm aware of. Doesn't mean it's not out there. And then I just don't know yet. We didn't put any in for remote notarizations, though. I know that much for a fact. What's coming? Who knows? There's always a surprise for us every legislative session. So who knows what it'll be? As for stats, if you give me a minute, I might have some numbers for you. Just in terms of remote notarizations through the years, kind of been all over. But last year we had just under 2,200 remote notary notification forms that were approved. The year before that, we had a little over 1,900. And then, that's state fiscal year. So, July 24 through June 25, just under 2,200. July 23 through June 24, just over 1,900. And for the years before that, it fluctuated between 1,000 and 1,400. So more recently, last couple of years, they've definitely been up.
Okay, and Laura asked, is there a sample certificate of what's supposed to be noted for Ron?
It's the standard certificate that is in the law with the addition of the following phrase. Give me a sec. I'm going to go right back to that slide that it appeared on. I just got to go find it. You know, you do all these things, you know it's in there. You just got to remember, where was it?
That might be left your cup outside. You left your cup outside.
You can mute yourself, folks, please, so we're not getting any of that feedback in the background. You know the wording's in here because I went over it. It's something you would add to the end of the existing notarial certificate, though. It's phrasing in here. Here it is. So, certificate of notarial act must indicate notarial act involved. This phrase right here. Add this into the certificate in some way, shape, or form. And that phrase is in the law and in the handbook.
We don't actually see it. Were you trying to show it?
Oh, you know why? Because I'm looking at the wrong, not looking at the PowerPoint, Carrie Ann. I'm looking at the slideshow, not the one I'm presenting. What is wrong with me? But that's okay, because that worked out. I just threw the wording in the chat. You can copy and paste that now.
Nice.
Yeah, I was not looking at the presentation of the PowerPoint. I was looking at my thing that I edit. Oops. Right there at the top. So you're not going to find in the law a specific certificate for remote notarial acts. Why? Because it's just it's a different vehicle by which you can deliver a notarization. Your certificate is either going to be one for an oath, affirmation, acknowledgement, official witness, attesting to a signature, certified copy, a tangible copy of an electronic record, protest. Those are your notarial acts. So there's a certificate for each of them. Whichever one of those notarial acts you do remotely, you want to add the phrasing. And I copied and pasted it into the chat. So feel free to go find the Michael Schlein chat, which should be very close to the bottom, if not at the bottom.
Yep.
Copy and paste that wording. Add it to the certificate. So the certificate must indicate the notarial act involved remotely located individual and performed using communication technology. So sworn and subscribed before me by Joe Smith on the 10th day of November 2025 by a remotely located individual and performed using communication technology. Sworn and subscribed before me on this 10th day of November 2025 by Jane Smith by a remotely located individual and performed using communication technology. So you're just adding that phrasing to the end of the notarial certificate, or make it a fresh sentence. Just got to add that wording. So there's not a specific certificate for a remote notarial act, because remote notarial act is not a type of notarization. It's a type of way to do the notarization. So the certificate that applies depends on the type of notarization, the type of notarial act. You just got to add that phrasing to signify it was done remotely using communication technology. So that's why there's not here's a certificate for every remote notarial act, because there are many different types of notarial acts that you can perform remotely. So you just got to add that phrasing and you're good. Again, it's in the chat. Copy and paste that. That chat will stay up until we close out here. So I think we'll conclude recording here, and we'll hang on if anybody wants to just talk one-on-one for a little bit at the end. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for fighting through me trying to talk today. Thanks for what you do in your service to the state as notaries. Town hall is recorded. It'll get posted online usually within about a week or so of the town hall. So within a week or so, might be earlier, might be very soon this week, might be end of this week. If it's not, give it a couple days more. We try to get it up as quickly as we can. Informational purposes only, not legal advice. You know where to find us. Should you need anything, reach out to the Notary Division. We do our best to get to you as quickly as possible and help out. Thank you all again.
I have a question.
Hang on.
Can I? Oh.
Hang on, please.